This conference will now be recorded.
Well, I guess that is my cue. And so I would just like to say good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Nettle, and I'm the current president of BOMA, Nova Scotia. And I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for our February regional webinar, ESG Demystified. This is a regional webinar, and so I would like to thank BOMA New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and BOMA Newfoundland for their collaboration and help with the logistics of the webinar today. Today's webinar is really meant to provide a high-level overview of ESG. We have more webinars are in the planning stages where we will explore each of these components in more detail as they relate to our commercial real estate industry. Just before we get going, I have a few technical notes, and I can't believe I'm giving technical notes. All participants are currently muted. We ask that you remain on mute to minimize any background noise. For the optimum viewing experience, we recommend that you switch your view to show active cameras. And this can be found as a drop-down option under the view button located at the top of your screen. Please use the chat box if you have any questions for presenters, and we will be going through questions at the end of the presentations. And so now on to our program for today. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenters. We have three very qualified speakers today, so we're looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Our first presenter is Megan Scott, and she's going to cover the E in ESG. Megan is the Manager of Sustainability and Business Operations at Commercial Properties Limited. For the past 8 years, she has managed the BOMA Best Sustainable Building certifications for 8 properties and is responsible for the development and implementation of sustainability practices within the commercial property portfolio. She is the current president of Sustainable St. John and serves on the Sustainability Committee for BOMA, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, as well on the working group for the Community Energy Action Plan for the City of St. John. Our second presenter will be Angela Langell, who will be covering off the S of ESG. Angela has approximately 15 years of progressive human resource experience across industries, including grocery retail, nonprofit, consulting, construction, and commercial real estate. She is currently Director, People and Culture with Crombie REIT, and most recently, prior to this role, she held the position of Director, Corporate Human Resources and Stakeholder Engagement with Lindsay Construction. As Crombie's Director, People and Culture, Angela acts as a strategic business partner and leader with accountability for the development and delivery of integrated people and culture programs that support organizational strategy and growth. Angela has a Master's of Science in Applied Psychology and an Executive MBA, both from St. Mary's University. She is a Chartered Professional in Human Resources and a Society of Human Resources Management Senior Certified. And lastly, but not least, our third speaker will be Anna Marie Manley, who will cover off the G of ESG. Anna Marie is a lawyer and partner in Patterson Law's litigation group. She practices civil litigation, including acting as counsel in commercial disputes, labor and employment matters, and administrative proceedings. Anna Marie joined Patterson Law in 2018, returning to her hometown of Truro after attending law school in Victoria, British Columbia, and then articling and practicing with a national law firm in Calgary, Alberta. Anna Marie's civil litigation experience includes experience before both the courts and regulatory bodies such as the Utility and Review Board, the National Energy Board. She uses skills from her engineering degree to enhance her understanding of scientific and technical issues and to explain legal matters in a way that makes sense to her clients. Anna Marie can assist with contract disputes, construction and environmental issues, and other civil matters such as claims and defamation, unjust enrichment, and negligence. So I will now turn the mic over to Megan, who will lead off with a discussion of the E of ESG. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin. And I'd like to say thanks as well to BOMA Nova Scotia and BOMA New Brunswick and PEI for having me on to speak today. So certainly with ESG, I think we could all agree that we've noticed a really rapid change in the cultural focus over the past 2 years. So we've seen this change, and from my perspective, especially with environmental practices, there's a few contributors to that I think are kind of easily identifiable. Certainly the impacts of climate change, and as well some investment firms that have put out some requirements for the investments they're going to make and having environmental practices as part of that evaluation. So, those are two big drivers, but I think we are just seeing a shift in our culture from a broader perspective in terms of, it's more environmental, social, and governance issues are more important to people. We expect more of our businesses. We expect them to have responsibility for more than just the bottom line. And that's really what ESG is all about. So certainly we do see that, in all levels of our organization that are focused on this now, whereas at one time might not have been. Even with our employees as well, when we hire people, they're starting to ask those questions. What environmental practices do you have in place? And certainly from our tenants. And so, if kind of doing the right thing, wasn't enough for certain people, then certainly our tenants' focus on it really has brought that into the forefront in the last couple of years. So, as Kevin mentioned, I'm going to do a high-level overview of the environmental aspects of ESG as it relates to the commercial real estate industry. And when we're thinking about environmental practices within that context, what we want to do is think about, okay, what areas of the environment do our operations have the biggest impact on? And so kind of the four big buckets of those are energy, water, waste, and greenhouse gases. So today we're going to look at kind of the practices we put in place and decisions we make in order to reduce our impacts in each of those areas when we're looking to be a responsible corporate citizen. So next slide, please, Christine. So energy, so I've divided energy up in kind of two areas. So we have energy use associated with our assets, kind of the physical pieces of those a little more, and then energy associated with our operations. So if we're looking to reduce our environmental impacts, organizations that do that from an asset perspective in a new build or say a renovation, we'll typically look at kind of these four main areas. Your envelope, so what's the quality of the windows you're putting in, what insulation levels do you have, and even what materials are you choosing to construct your building with. Lighting, of course, I think that's kind of the most obvious one for everybody. So and kind of kicked off, I guess, the environmental retrofits in our industry. So the LED fixtures, moving to LED fixtures. And then with HVAC systems, so looking at using the most, I guess, efficient equipment possible. So certainly heat pumps for ventilation, energy recovery, ventilators, and yeah, so making choices in those areas that reduce your energy consumption. And then, so kind of the last aspect I have here would be your management hardware and software tools. So that's where we get into controllers and sensors. So, could be occupancy sensors on your lighting or sensors that monitor your HVAC system, and then feeding that information into a building control system. So having, I guess that's a building operating system, basically. So the computer that interacts and runs your HVAC system and your lighting. And then some of the more kind of forward thinking or innovations in that area leads us to look at fault detection and diagnostics. So that's where we're taking our building control systems and using them to do a little bit more. So instead of just an alarming system that tells us when something's wrong, which your building control system will do, it will give us more information and more insight as to why that's happened, why those problems are happening, and where you might go to fix them. And then kind of the next step along that path are supervisory systems, which typically include machine learning. So kind of learning from sensors and your building automation system how your building reacts to different conditions, and then being able to kind of automatically adjust your HVAC operations according to outside air conditions or weather, occupancy, and things of that nature. So those are kind of some really exciting developments. Next slide, please. And then, so for operations, some of the things that organizations are focusing on to reduce and their energy use, certainly commissioning. So there's a lot of talk about that right now, and all of the commissioning. So it feels like every time you turn around, there's another type of commissioning happening. I believe there's 4 now. So new commissioning, so when you have a new build, making sure that all the systems that you have installed are working together and working properly as intended. Recommissioning, so whenever your conditions change in the building, so you have an expansion or retrofit a new tenant with new requirements, you're going through your systems to make sure that that they are suited to those changes. Retro commissioning, so that is when, say you have an existing building that was never commissioned. So it's a more elaborate process of going through, finding your initial specifications and really going through the process of ensuring that building is operating properly. And then ongoing commissioning. So that's kind of the cutting edge of the commissioning world. So where you're really wanting to ensure on a regular basis that your control system is operating as it's intended. So really a lot more of a constant focus on your controls and making adjustments. And then of course training, so that's a big focus as well. If you want to ensure that your staff really have the understanding they need of your systems and the processes required to operate your buildings. And then energy monitoring and management processes. So that's a big one as well right now. So there's funding from the federal government on an ISO 50001 ready certification. And that's really about making sure that you have the processes in place to understand your energy consumption, manage it, and then have the checks and balances, in place to make sure that things are being performed as intended. And then, of course, preventative and predictive maintenance. So I think we're all pretty up to speed on preventative maintenance. So making sure that we have our HVAC specialists go in and fine tune our equipment and have a look, check on them, make sure that everything's performing as required. And then so kind of the innovation there, people are looking more towards predictive maintenance. So using those tools that we discussed on the previous slide, the software and building controls and fault detection diagnostic software, to understand kind of ahead of time when a piece of equipment might fail. So you're using that information and data to decide your maintenance schedule, as opposed to just saying every quarter or every, biannually, all the equipment gets checked. You're using that to really only go in when you need to, when it can tell you when kind of a problem is starting. So yeah, hopefully saving kind of time and money there. So next slide, please. So the next bucket we have is water. So certainly, a little more a little less complex than energy processes. So if you're looking to reduce water consumption or manage your water properly, so some things that you would focus on in the commercial real estate industry is, of course, your fixtures. So having low flow or dual flush type toilets, urinals, and your faucets, sensors on those. There are kind of other options for buildings as well, gray water or rainwater capture. So you are kind of recycling the water within your building and therefore reducing your water consumption. Drought tolerant landscaping, of course, so planting plants that don't require a lot of irrigation. And then finally, you know, similar to the energy piece, real-time water metering and monitoring. So you can understand if you're having water leaks or water problems in a timely fashion and getting those dealt with. Next slide, please. So then we have waste. So that is another big bucket. Of course, we all, you know, we all understand kind of some of the challenges with, I think recycling might be one of the most difficult ones to get tenant engagement with, but certainly the first step to that is offering all possible recycling streams in your area. So for us here in New Brunswick, you know, that can include batteries, electronics, compost, recyclables, refundables, and it does differ by a geographical area at times, so that can be challenging, but and then having sorting stations available. So that's another measure people usually will look into to make it easy. So have convenient sorting stations located for building occupants. Communication to tenants, again, to make sure they understand the system, and communication to custodial staff as well to make sure that they understand. And I find that those two practices have some of the biggest impacts, really, is communication is key in this area. Okay, and the final one. Great, so GHG emissions, which is kind of the last big bucket that we look at in environmental practices in our industry. So I just have a quick little overview there of emissions because I think it's something that certainly not everyone understands fully yet. I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, decarbonization, but when we're thinking about it from our perspective in our industry, if you own your building, you're really talking about your Scope 1 emissions, which are your natural gas and fuel oil from your buildings. And then if you have any fleet vehicles, fuel from those. Your Scope 2 emissions would include your electricity at your owned buildings. And then Scope 3 emissions, so if you work for an organization that manages properties as opposed to owns them, basically all of your emissions would be in this bucket. So where in a managed property, the natural gas and fuel oil and electricity from those properties would land in your Scope 3. And then, so the kind of the next, I guess, the next area that is being looked at in terms of emissions are embodied emissions. So those would be emissions that are generated from your construction. So instead of just thinking about, okay, what emissions are we, you know, what emissions are we having from our operations of our buildings? We're also then looking at, okay, what emissions were caused from or generated from constructing the asset. So that could be the materials that, you know, mostly the materials that you use to build that building and emissions associated with that. So some of the things certainly that people are looking to do to reduce their emissions, kind of in addition to reducing their energy consumption, because that's kind of the first step or the best way to reduce your emissions is to reduce your energy use. But some other things that people are really focusing on now is electrification. So that is when you're retrofitting your building system, when you're changing out a boiler, it's at the end of life, maybe you look to an all-electric heating solution. And then as well for your fleets, looking at EVs as opposed to gas vehicles. And then some other things, of course, renewables. So people are starting with solar panels on roof and on-site battery storage to try to reduce emissions as well. And then finally, so what, when you do have all these kind of practices in place and these four kind of big buckets, it's not necessarily enough just to have those practices, but it's also about the process. So in each of those areas, you should be auditing. So having a good understanding of what your current state of things, and an audit will also give you suggestions for improvement with your savings, the cost, and an ROI from implementing those measures. Next step, put in place a plan where you implement and set targets based on the measures that you've chosen. And then you implement them at all the types of measures that we've just talked about. And then, once you've done that, it's also important to track performance so that you know if you're meeting your targets or not. Energy Star Portfolio Manager is a free, excellent tool that allows you to do that, and it allows you to track your energy, water, waste, and carbon. And then finally, reporting. So that's kind of the last step as well. So make sure your teams internally understand how you're doing, the results, and then if you choose as well, external reporting or disclosure to the public, to shareholders, and then, yeah, completing certifications like BOMA Best or GRESB can also help with that process. And that's all I've got. So I think we're saving questions until the end. So I think you can put them in the chat, but we'll be addressing them at the end of the presentation. And I'm going to pass it over to Angela.
Thank you, Megan. So again, I'm Angela Langell. I'm with Crombie REIT, and I'm going to talk about the S of ESG. So we can go on to the next slide. And what I wanted to point out here was kind of where the social sits in the context of ESG, and I suspect you'll find as we go through that the social kind of branches a little bit into environmental and branches a little bit into governance as well. So there's definitely crossover, especially from the perspective that it takes people to do everything, and social is really about people. And the first thing that I'll mention as well, so I'm going to talk about a lot of different bits and pieces of information here. And as Megan kind of mentioned, what is important or material can really be industry specific. And to even take it a step further, it can potentially be organizational specific as well. So when you're looking at what your metrics are, or what is important to your organization, or what you're going to report on, you really have to look at what is most important or most material for your specific organization. So moving on to social, the first aspect or first bucket that I'll talk about is really about your workforce. So this is your employees, your internal workforce, and is the people within kind of the four walls or the virtual four walls of your organization. So it really focuses on safety, wellness, pay equity, all these sorts of things. I will highlight a couple. I won't go into each one of these factors in detail. But for example, occupational health and safety or physical health and safety refers to safe work conditions, safe work practices, PPE as a final line of defense there. So that's really about the occupational health and safety of your employees and anyone who's on any of your premises. Next is psychological safety or psychological health and safety. This is a very big and hot topic right now, one that we talk a lot about at Crombie, but a workplace that promotes psychological well-being and actively works to reduce harm to psychological health is a psychologically safe workplace. It is related to mental health, but it's not purely applicable to people who have mental health concerns. Psychological safety is really important to everybody, whether they have mental health issues or barriers or not. So there is a national standard of Canada that's called the National Standard of Psychological Safety that you can look to for guidance on how to assess your workplace. Many of the other factors within this workforce bucket are applicable to psychological safety as well. So another one I'll talk about is labor standards. So there are in Canada, there are federal labor standards and there's also various provincial labor standards. So it really depends which ones your organization follows, really depends on what type of organization you are. So most of our organizations would follow provincial employment legislations, and then federally regulated industries. Transportation and communications are two examples, would be under federal labor standards. But these standards, as well as provincial standards, really protect health and safety, working conditions. They talk about human rights, and there's a lot of guidance that is provided and legally must be followed, so that they all fall under the social. Another aspect that I'll highlight is privacy and data security. So we all know about cybersecurity. These days, there's been a lot of talk, and from this specific perspective of your workforce, you want to be keeping your employees' data that is private. So things like social insurance numbers, pay data, all those types of pieces of information, you want to ensure security. And then there's a few related areas around diversity, equity, and inclusion, harassment and discrimination. So this is all about kind of inclusion in the workplace and everybody having a safe workplace where they have equal opportunity to succeed and be successful. And training and development, I'll hit on a little bit as well. And this really relates to providing ongoing opportunities for development and growth for all of the employees within your organization. So the next big bucket that I'll talk about kind of takes it one step further. So first we were talking about your workforce, so the employees internal to your organization, and next we'll talk about the bucket of value chain, which expands to your suppliers and customers. So again, this goes kind of beyond the internal workforce, but in terms of suppliers, some of the things that we think about are, what does your supply chain look like? So, and this is, you know, what are all the bits and pieces that go into making up your product, or even the equipment that you use on a day-to-day basis. And what does that, so the organizations that are your suppliers, what are their work practices like? So if we think about the workforce bucket that I just talked about, for all of the suppliers and contractors and vendors that you work with, what workforce practices are they following? Another topic that is really popular and important for the social aspect of ESG is supplier diversity. So we will see this more and more, but this really points to the topic of whether you're using one group of preferred suppliers, and that is the group you use. Are they all the same, you know, same type, same group, or do other more diverse suppliers and vendors have an opportunity to participate? And do they know how to become a supplier if they're not a supplier now? So what if I want to become a supplier to Crombie, which is my organization, do I know how to even approach Crombie to do that? Another thing that we look at here, which I kind of touched on, is labor practices within those organizations. So do they provide fair wages? Do they provide good working conditions for their employees? All of those things. And with your suppliers, you will want to communicate what your expectations are of them and evaluate how they're doing against the criteria set. So this will become more popular or more prevalent, I guess I will say. As time goes on, we're seeing this a fair amount in kind of government and public contracts. And I believe it will kind of filter over into the private world as well. So looking at the customer side, shifting gears a little bit, you look at things like, is your product safe? So, and this can be, how safe is your premises as well? So what are the liabilities and safety risks to customers? And are your customers or clients or tenants protected from harm? Is your product offered at a fair price? So in some cases, we could say in our industry or commercial real estate, we could say, you know, are your properties rents offered at a fair price? But really, that's just about taking a look at what the market is doing, and are you too far outside of that? Do you identify risks and let the customers know what the risks are? So I think we can all think of some examples where risks were identified in the automotive industry, not mentioning any names, and the end customer wasn't notified of those risks. And then there were huge accidents and loss of life. So we want to prevent that and let customers know when the risks are there. Again, privacy and data security comes up here again. Do you keep customers and clients and tenant information private? And do you protect your systems where the information is stored to keep everything secure and confidential? And then the final item I'll note here is just, you know, customer service. So what's your customer service philosophy and what are your customer service practices? Do you track customer and tenant satisfaction, and how do you act on the results? And do you communicate the results with your tenants and your customers? And next, I will talk about communities and society. So this again takes it one step further. So it's almost a bigger picture, more broad view. But this is really around communities, the communities that you operate in, and just general society and the general public. So again, familiar themes here that we've been talking about all along, but we were talking about human rights here. So one aspect of this, and we'll kind of see it kind of right next door to the human rights box on the slide there, but is your product or service accessible to underserviced or equity-seeking groups? So are there any barriers that might be preventing access to certain groups? So that's something to take a look at. Are there any opportunities to create relationships with community organizations to build kind of win-win partnerships? So again, it will depend on the organizations around you as well as your organization, but there may be opportunities there. And then in general, this includes economic impacts, so job creation, bringing money to other businesses in the community where you operate, spending money in local communities when you do business there. So very much community oriented. And then next, I will kind of switch gears a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that we've looked a lot into. I've done a fair amount of work around at Crombie, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and psychological safety. So this goes back to the very first workforce bucket. But this is an example of kind of how this comes to life in an organization. But we did about a year and a half ago a survey around DEI and psychological safety, and we found that we had a handful of strengths and a handful of opportunities. So you can kind of see here our employees felt respected. They felt the company had solid ethics and integrity. People were encouraged to be their authentic selves. And on the opportunity side, people really asked for more DEI training, and they wanted to know more about what Crombie was doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we did just, this is a high-level summary of a survey that we did, but learning this information really allowed us to take some concrete steps moving forward. I'll highlight another example next. Again, this is in the workforce bucket, but it's just an example of how we looked at learning and development. And so what we did was worked with, we had a learning and development strategy committee or group that looked at prioritizing certain actions. And so what we did was we had a very big list of things that we wanted to do, but what we ended up doing was looking at, okay, what we took kind of a matrix view to help us prioritize, and we looked at high and low impact and high and low effort or cost to implement certain initiatives or activities. And you can see here, just as an example, the one that we looked at first, kind of on the left-hand side of this, the screen at the middle, was to show individual contributors how to put their hand up for development opportunities and how to put their hand up and let us know that they wanted to do more. So as a result of that, you know, it was pretty low effort to provide that type of resource. We thought it would have a fairly high impact. So we created a guideline and a toolkit to help employees and managers have those conversations. So again, just an example. And then on the next slide, I have an example of how building factors. So this is kind of getting back to the E side that Megan talked about, but just an example of how one area can impact another. So if you look at green offices, for example, if you make changes in the environment, it can enhance employee health, well-being, productivity, can generally reduce expenses, and just kind of, you know, create positive impacts to the economy as well. So I'll go into this just kind of a little bit more on the next slide as well. And I don't know if you can see the writing there in the image, but those are just examples of, you know, green building examples of things that people can do. So it's moving over into the E side. So again, more of an example of how taking some environmental actions can really increase employee productivity inside your own organization, but ultimately or produce happier tenants as well. So making changes to air quality and ventilation, temperature, lighting, kind of acoustics and sound, security, just layout, look and feel, connections to nature, even location and access to amenities. So making changes or enhancing any and all of those things can really have some positive tenant impacts. It can reduce their costs. It can increase their employee productivity and their retention, and ultimately it can help them meet their own ESG objectives or meet their own CSR goals that they may be working towards. And I think that's everything for me. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to be turning it over to Anna Marie.
Thanks very much, Angela. So I am the final letter of the trilogy. So I'm speaking today about governance. And again, just to, from a lawyer legal perspective. So I'll be getting into that a little bit. But if you could go to the next slide, please. This is, I guess, my plug to everybody for why, from kind of a legal governance perspective, why ESG is important and kind of how to look at it. So just to keep in mind, ESG was developed as an investment tool. So to look at organizations from the point of view of their investors. And so a key aspect of that is being able to document and being able to show what you're doing. So it's great to have lots of good initiatives in place. It is very important from an ESG perspective to be able to show your investors or anybody else who you're trying to demonstrate all this to, all the great things that you as an organization are doing. So I really liked what was said earlier by Megan about the process and kind of that auditing through to the reporting. And I think that's a really great way to look at it in all aspects, not just the environmental aspect. So, and as Angela alluded to when she was talking about, hiring suppliers based on their social actions that they were taking. So even if you don't have investors to report to, if your organization isn't publicly traded, doesn't have to engage in some of the reporting requirements that I'm talking about, it may still be relevant to your lives in demonstrating why you should be hired as a supplier or why you should get a particular contract. And so I was recently last spring at a conference in London. There were law firms from around the world, and less so in Canada still, but particularly law firms from Europe and Australia were actually saying that they were being asked to demonstrate what they were doing as firms to promote their ESG as a factor in being awarded certain types of tenders or contracts. So I agree with Angela. I think it is coming that you will maybe being asked to demonstrate how you are meeting the ESG criteria or what you're doing to get there at some point in time. So if we could go to the next slide. This is if you Google governance, this is what you get. This is what Oxford Languages tells you is a definition of governance, the action or manner of governing. It's not super helpful. Governance is a really broad topic. It's a little bit of an amorphous one, but I think the way to think about it is on the next slide, which is that, in my view, it really should be a double G, good governance. So every organization is existing. You have policies and procedures in place, so everybody is governing, so that's great. But really, when we're looking at good governance, we're looking at the framework that allows an organization to reach its goals while managing its risk. So obviously, a key goal is profit. Other goals are, reaching that E and S in the ESG, so the environmental and the social, accountability, transparency. So an organization has lots of those goals. Governance is really about that framework to get to those goals. And like I said before, every organization has governance. So probably your organization is doing a lot of these things already. And even if you don't have a formal ESG plan in place, really a lot of the work you may end up doing is more about just proving what you are doing or making plans to do what you're doing a little bit better in some areas or being able to show what you're doing in some of these areas. So on the next slide, one thing that if you're thinking through your organization's ESG plan to think about is to start with who is making the decisions in your organization and who is guiding that strategic plan and leadership. And the flip side of thinking about who has a voice is thinking about who doesn't. So if you, and go to the next slide, not every organization is a co-op. Everybody's got a different structure for their leadership team. But you'll see, and I've got some resources at the end. There's been a lot of research done into the business case for having diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, and leadership in an organization, and that is something that has been recognized in that ESG framework. So I'll get into kind of those reporting requirements in a second here, but ways to look at or to think about having diversity in your leadership or diversity in your organization's perspective. First off, looking at diversity, balance of perspectives in your leadership team. But other ways to do it might be using committees to get different perspectives. So if you don't have the diversity on a particular issue in your leadership team, maybe you set up a committee to deal with an issue where you want to get that diversity of thought and opinion, or you think it's really valuable to get that diversity of thought and opinion. You can look at collecting feedback from your employees, reverse mentoring, which is essentially asking employees to mentor their leaders, their supervisors or managers on what they could do, and taking that into account and seeing what kind of feedback that you might get from those folks. And then reviewing your hiring practices to look for implicit bias. So one of the resources I've included at the end here is implicit bias, like online testing. That it's just an available resource. It's developed through Harvard, and it's actually quite interesting to do. I've done a bunch of it myself, and everybody has biases. We all know this, but we're not always aware of our own biases. And it's, I think, a worthwhile exercise and a little bit fun to do. It's kind of an online quiz that you do. So take a look at that if you have a chance. So on the legal side of things here, sometimes there are legal requirements to look at your leadership and board diversity. So specifically since 2014, if an organization is listed on the TSX, they have put in place what they call a comply or explain system, essentially about gender diversity on board levels. So you, as an organization, if you are an issuer through the TSX, you have to either have gender representation on your board, or you have to explain why not or what you are doing about that. And so there's no mandatory minimum percentage, but there is a requirement to go through that exercise of looking at the issue. And what they have found is, even though there is no requirement, the fact that folks are looking into the issue has actually caused the percentage to go up. So this, it looks like my site got a little hidden behind the table, but this does comes from the TSX's own reporting. And it just shows that 2015, about 12% of women, or 12% of board seats were occupied by women on TSX listed companies in 2015. So shortly after they introduced this requirement. In 2021, we were up to almost 24%. And then if we look at Standard & Poor's, the TSX Composite Index, that went from 18.3% up to almost 32%. So they're just tracking that part of, what Megan talked about earlier when there was the track part of the process. This is the TSX tracking the effect of this requirement here. And so if you look at moving that forward, so since January 1st, 2020, so that was dealing with gender on board, or specifically women on boards. We now have anybody who is a distributing corporation under the Canada Business Corporations Act is required to report in their inclusion of certain designated groups, so women, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities, and that's the exact language from the CBCA, in their board and senior management. And again, it's that same kind of like report or explain requirement, comply or explain requirement, where you're not necessarily, there's no percentage requirement, but there is a requirement to kind of look at the issue and explain how your organization is either working towards that goal or why that goal may not make sense in your industry. And so while this doesn't affect the broad variety, most organizations in Canada don't fall under this requirement. It is an indication that, that exercise did make a difference. So if it's something your organization is looking into, that really kind of comply or explain, or that track and report obligation can really help. So if you're looking at your own processes, that might be something you want to think about. Now, we looked at who is making decisions, but the other part of governance is how decisions are being made. So there's various processes, policies, bylaws that every organization has in place. So you're looking at what exists to protect your investors or your organization as a whole, what is in place to promote the organization's goals, and how are risks and responsibilities managed and distributed within the organization. And so those are kind of general high-level guiding questions. But I've identified here a few kinds of policies. So on the next slide, I start listing, like there's a few different kinds of policies that you may want to look at from a governance perspective, and whether they make sense to your organization. So some of these won't make sense to everybody, or won't make sense in their particular industry or particular thing you are doing within the industry. But these are some ideas that you can think about for what make sense for your organization. So a big part of good governance is auditing, oversight, transparency. So thinking about what policies, procedures you have in place to make sure that your organization can explain or justify what it's doing, be that to investors, to your senior leadership, to other companies that you are forming partnerships with, to your tenants, or to whoever may have a legitimate right to know that information. Board terms and reappointment processes or succession. So thinking about if you have board terms, for example, do those terms overlap rather than having a fresh board, entirely new board, potentially every few years, and just making sure that you've got some succession planning in place, especially for your senior folks, so that you're not losing their institutional knowledge when they retire or move on to somewhere else, that you've got some redundancy in place to make sure you save a lot of that knowledge and learning that they've done. This ties into, we talked about, there's kind of that overlap between diversity, between the E, S, and G. So code of conduct or anti-harassment policies. So making sure that you've got or thought about what kind of policies or procedures in place to protect your employees. Conflict of interest, anti-corruption, or lobbying. There's various ways to look at this issue, but it's important. Conflicts of interest arise a lot. It's a question we in the legal profession get all the time, is, what is a conflict of interest? Is this a conflict? How is it arisen? The general kind of overview of conflict of interest is, are you in a position to prefer somebody else's interests over the organizations that you are supposed to be working for? And really putting some thought into how you want to address conflicts of interest that may arise. Disclosure and reporting. So Megan had talked earlier about that kind of track and report. So you may have an obligation to report, or you may choose to report, or you may be asked to report through kind of ESG assessment if you are applying for a particular contract or tender, or promoting yourself to tenants, or promoting yourself to suppliers, or vice versa. So I've flagged here this National Instrument 51107. So that's, again, a Securities Commission regulation, and I just flag it. It's one that they have been consulting on, but it's about environmental reporting. So they were consulting on it. It's not, to my knowledge, still in limbo. It's been consulted on, but hasn't been rejected or accepted yet. But just to bear in mind, like I talked earlier about that board composition reporting, they're now looking at environmental reporting as well. Data and privacy and cybersecurity. So those, again, are good governance policies to have in place, and also feed into the S when we're talking about, when Angela was talking about psychological safety and feeling secure at work. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So again, this partly there's some overlap, again, even among these policies, but executive compensation is something to look at from a good governance perspective. How is that structured? How does it incentivize folks to do their best? How are you making sure it's fair and not biased? Risk reporting and supply chain management, another thing to look at from a good governance perspective. And finally, I've listed whistleblower protections. There are obviously many more aspects to government or governance governance, but keeping in mind, like these are just some general topics to think through and consider where you want to look at focusing your ESG, specifically your G efforts, if you're looking into developing your ESG a little bit further. All right, so then the next slide. So as a lawyer, I love to plug putting in place formal processes and policies and bylaws. But just a reminder that the only good policy is one that's actually followed. So if you're making lots of goals when you're working towards ESG, just keep in mind that a policy should be reviewed. It should be something that you are able to and plan to follow. And sometimes that doesn't work out. Sometimes we make ambitious plans in our policies or procedures. So it's a good idea to kind of take a look at your policies from time to time and make sure that they are matching. Or maybe you can go further with your policy. Maybe you start off with a pretty cautious policy or procedure or cautious goals, and that's working great, and you decide you want to go further. So then you know you can go further. And one thing I suggest is, if you're not sure about a policy, if this is a new area that you're moving into through ESG, you can always have a working group and get feedback from a smaller group before rolling out a policy to your larger organization. Just help to troubleshoot, and again, going back to getting that diversity of opinion. Somebody else may look at the policy or procedure but differently, may raise something you hadn't thought about before, and may bring a really valuable insight to what you're doing. So on the last slide that I have, I had put together just a couple of resources to get you started. If you're looking for a couple of things to check out, there's lots of stuff out there on ESG. You could spend ages learning about a lot of it. There are podcasts, there are presentations, there are articles you can read. So whatever way you like to do your learning, if it's something you're interested in, there are options out there. So I've just identified a few different ones. I talked about a few earlier. So Toronto Stock Exchange, like I said, has that Comply or Explain. They do have a bit of an overview on ESG on their website. The 50-30 Challenge is a federal government initiative about board diversity. So there's some information on there about including lots of statistics for data on why board diversity is a great idea. Project Implicit, I talked about earlier, your implicit bias testing. That's kind of I think a learning experience, but also kind of a fun activity for anyone who likes to do a little bit of online quiz type things. And then if you're looking specifically for some guidance, I think the Standard & Poor's article on what is the G in ESG can give you a bit of a high level overview. Some of the same stuff I talked about today, but if you want to be able to read through their thoughts. So those are the kind of 4 resources I've set out there, but like I said, there's many, many more. You can do lots of reading on this topic, and if anybody else has any particularly good resources they want to suggest, absolutely pass them along. So that's it for me today, and I think we were going to have some open time for question and answers, so I'll pass it back to Kevin.